For me, studying was a way to get a meal. I only read textbooks because my parents and teachers insisted on it. But now it's different.
Grandma will keep working hard until Sophia grows up, okay?
Her trembling hands gently embraced my shoulders during my grandfather's funeral.
You always eat with such a happy face, Sophia. It makes me smile too.
You can rely on me like you would on one of your uncles, all right?
The cheerful neighbors who smiled warmly as I munched on the apples they gave me. I want to protect this place. And to do that, I must become wiser than anyone else. The summer of my second year in middle school, I opened a textbook of my own free will for the first time in my life. My name is Sophia. Every morning, I grind fresh coffee beans and drink a cup of coffee as part of my routine. Even when waking up feels hard after a busy workday, the rich aroma of coffee wafting through the air motivates me to take on the day. Drinking coffee in a 130-year-old traditional house might make city folks excited about how Instagrammable it is. But for me, sitting on the porch, gazing at the potato fields while sipping coffee, is just part of my daily life.
You seem unusually relaxed today.
My grandmother, carrying an armful of corn, walked slowly toward me after returning from working in the fields. There haven't been any emergency cases since last night. By the way, can you bring some freshly picked corn for my lunch?
Sure, Sophia. No matter how old or accomplished you get, you're still a foodie, aren't you?
Yeah. I couldn't help but respond to her words with a childlike laugh. Life is busy, but it's warm and fulfilling. But the only reason I have this peaceful life now is that my parents abandoned me in the mountains when I was 10. It was 20 years ago. Back then, I lived with my family in a seaside town that swelled with beachgoers in the summer. My dad was a banker, and my mom was a homemaker. We were a slightly more affluent family than average. Both were enthusiastic about education and spared no expense for their children. My older brother Louis, who was 2 years older than me, was showered with prenatal care during my mom's pregnancy and was enrolled in baby classes as early as infancy. Perhaps because of this or his natural aptitude, he excelled in school and consistently ranked among the top in his grade. On the other hand, ever since I was little, I preferred playing tag with friends over sitting in a chair and drawing, so I never found much interest or meaning in studying. Although I attended after-school tutoring classes, it was only because my parents insisted, and I did so reluctantly. My grades were middling at best. Disappointed by my lack of achievement, my parents grew increasingly cold toward me. It was one thing to be pulled out of tutoring classes, but they stopped attending my school events entirely.
It's embarrassing to show up as the parent of a failed kid.
When my friend saw my mom in the hallway and asked me curiously, I was too sad to say anything.
I saw your mom at school. Why didn't she come to your class?
Of course, it was because she spent all 45 minutes in my brother's class. And when she came home, she was beaming with pride and wouldn't even look at me.
Louis is truly a genius.
She would only talk to relatives and neighbors about how talented and obedient my brother was, as if I didn't exist. It was lonely, but I resigned myself to believing it was my fault for hating studying. When Louis reached the 6th grade, my parents decided to enroll him in a prestigious private school in New York. Naturally, this required him to take entrance exams, so they doubled down on his education. Louis, eager to meet their expectations, continued to perform well in school. But national standardized tests were a different story. This was a small seaside town in the countryside. It was the kind of place that focused more on elderly welfare than education. Finding quality educational resources here was challenging. Determined to get their prodigy into a good school in the city, my parents started sending him to a prep school in Manhattan every weekend by train. Of course, this required a considerable amount of money and time. Naturally, that part was cut off from me. For Louis to excel academically, he was given lavish breakfasts with several dishes every morning and balanced lunches to take with him to his tutoring classes. Meanwhile, my breakfast was a single slice of toast, and on weekends, since my parents would leave with Louis for his classes, I eat cereal. I stayed home alone until past 6 p.m. Even so, on sunny days, I played with friends at the park, and sometimes friends' families, sensing my situation, would invite me over for lunch. So while I felt lonely, I still managed to have a fairly enjoyable time. But even if we were slightly affluent, money wasn't unlimited. Even if Louis passed the private school entrance exams, the expenses wouldn't stop there. Gradually, my parents began to see giving even a slice of bread to a failure like me as a waste. Right at the beginning of my winter break in 4th grade, my parents took me on a trip.
We're going to visit Grandpa's house.
By Grandpa, they meant my maternal grandparents' house, which was about 2 hours away in the mountains. We usually visited on Christmas Day, so I just thought it was one day earlier than usual. What struck me more was that Louis wasn't coming with us.
Hey, why isn't Louis coming?
When I asked my dad who was driving, he answered in a quiet voice.
Louis has his exams coming up. He needs to stay home and study.
I see.
Would my parents, who doted on my brother, really leave him behind to visit our grandparents? Seeing my puzzled expression, my mom gave me a gentle smile.
I thought we'd take a trip with just the three of us for once. I've been paying so much attention to Louis, and I realized you might have been feeling lonely. I'm sorry about that.
Mom.
Her words made my nose sting. I truly had been lonely. No matter how much I tried to rationalize or endure it, I couldn't help but feel left out. After all, I was just an ordinary 10-year-old girl. Listening to my parents chat happily in the front seats, I gazed out the window at the passing scenery, feeling a mix of emotions. Even now, thinking about the happiness I felt then and the crushing despair that followed makes me feel sick. When we arrived at my grandparents' house for the first time in a year, they gave us a warm welcome. We had beef stew with our smiling parents in a fireplace room in the snowy mountains.
Go take a bath.
I felt full and sleepy, responding vaguely to my grandmother's voice while I dozed off in front of the fireplace. But soon, I heard my grandfather yelling at the entrance.
You wanted Louis and Sophia to be born. How dare you treat them differently? Are you even their mother? Stop. Where do you think you're going?
I could only hear my grandfather's voice, but I knew exactly who his anger was directed at. And I also knew that I was the reason for it. A sense of dread filled me. I quickly ran down the empty hallway to the entrance. As I stepped outside of my socks, I saw my dad's car taillights disappearing through the gate.
Damn it.
My grandfather cursed, angrily kicking the ground.
Hey, Dad, Mom,
Staring in shock at the gate, I felt my grandmother gently patting my back as she cried.
I'm so sorry, Sophia.
In that moment, I realized the truth. It wasn't my brother they had left behind today. It was me. Snow that had lightly settled was soaking through my socks. The chill that pierced my core that day is something I will never forget. And so, on Christmas Eve when I was 10, my parents abandoned me. My grandparents were furious at the inhumane way my parents had treated me. They repeatedly called and protested, but my parents, saying they didn't want to disrupt Louis's crucial time, eventually stopped answering altogether.
enough already.
Clenching the phone that wouldn't connect, my grandfather, with veins bulging on his forehead, turned to me as I shook my head.
Enough? No way.
It's fine. I don't want to feel any more miserable.
When I muttered quietly, my grandfather choked up, unable to speak. After staring at the phone for a moment, he gently placed it back and patted my head with his hand.
Forget about people like that. Your grandma and I will give you all the love you need, Sophia.
I nodded slightly at my grandfather's serious gaze as he said those words.
You weren't abandoned by your parents. You abandoned those good-for-nothing parents.
I quietly took my grandfather's bitter words to heart. As the mournful Christmas holidays ended, I transferred to a small elementary school in the little town where my grandparents lived. With only about 50 students in the whole school, it felt like everyone had known each other since they were born. I was the only one who seemed completely out of place. But everyone welcomed me warmly, teaching me all sorts of mountain-specific games. When it snowed, we played in the snow, and when it piled up high, everyone brought their sleds from home, and we slid down the small hills together. A kind neighbor lady shared apple pie, saying, "I made too much," and we huddled in a lopsided igloo to enjoy it. When I told them my old schoolyard smelled of the ocean, my classmates said, "That sounds like something from a movie," and looked at me with envy. Every day, I played hard, laughed hard, ate plenty, and fell asleep exhausted. The sadness that had weighed me down gradually lifted. In such a small rural town, I'm sure the news that I was a child abandoned by my parents spread quickly. Yet everyone was kind, not just because I was friendly, but because of my grandparents' good character. Whether walking through town or shopping at the small store, my grandparents were always greeted warmly by someone. They cherished me deeply, even though I must have seemed like nothing but a burden. When I started having nightmares about being abandoned, they comforted me over and over, patting my back until I calmed down. I still wasn't interested in studying, but I was thrilled when both my grandparents came to watch me on school open day. I kept glancing back nervously, only to get scolded by the teacher. Even then, my grandparents just laughed. By the time the snow stopped piling on the hills and roses began to bud, I had grown to love life in this town. I didn't know whether Louis got into his dream middle school or how happy my parents were about it. Without knowing, I kept growing older. 4 years later, when I was in 8th grade, my grandfather complained of stomach pain one morning and passed away 3 days later. If he had been taken to a large hospital right away, his life might have been saved. But this town only had a small clinic, and even its doctor was in his 80s. For urgent injuries or illnesses, patients had to be transported by ambulance or airlifted to a bigger hospital in a nearby city. However, when my grandfather's condition worsened, it was a day of relentless rain. Landslides blocked the major roads, and the conditions made it impossible for the medevac helicopter to fly. As I sat in a daze during my kind grandfather's funeral, my mom appeared. Meeting her again after 4 years, she smirked while looking down at my grandfather's coffin.
I knew leaving a place like this was the right decision, dying without even proper medical care. What a joke.
What?
You'd better leave as soon as you finish high school, too. I gave you a face that's cute enough, so even if you can't study, you'll find a man and get by, won't you?
Had her face, her voice, always been this ugly? How could she speak such cruel words when her own father had just passed away? How could she tell her own daughter to use her looks to survive? Leaving me shaking with disappointment and anger, my mom walked over to my grandmother. She shamelessly brought up the topic of inheritance, and her behavior made me sick to my stomach. I love my kind grandparents. I love the people in this town who treated me like family. If anyone dares to mock them, even if it's my own blood, I can't forgive them. I'll never become an adult who tosses aside anything they can't control like you. I'll protect this town. Staring at the white smoke rising from the crematorium, I made a quiet resolution. That day, for the first time in my life, I realized the value of studying. I decided to study hard, become a doctor, and support emergency medical care in this town. It might have been a simple goal, but I made up my mind. From that moment, I studied as if I were a completely different person. I studied so much that my grandmother would nervously pace back and forth in front of my room. I took a 30-minute bus ride to an advanced prep school in the neighboring town and even enrolled in a correspondence course. After successfully getting into the top high school in the area, I continued studying for university entrance. Around that time, I told my grandmother about my dream of becoming a doctor and asked for her support. Hearing my determination, she teared up and encouraged me.
I'll do anything for you, Sophia.
After a high school life dedicated to studying, I was accepted directly into a state medical school. I studied there for 6 years, worked at a general hospital for 4 years, and returned to the town at the age of 28. By then, the local clinic had already closed, leaving the town without a doctor. I used the former clinic's site to build my own new clinic. I hired a few staff members, including 2 friends who had promised back in high school, "When you open your clinic, make sure you hire us." Though small, the clinic was well equipped and staffed with skilled people. I was worried about whether the townspeople would accept me, but they swarmed in as if to say they had been waiting for me all along. My specialty is internal medicine, but since there are no other hospitals, patients with all kinds of illnesses come to see me. To be honest, the pressure is immense and challenging, but I knew that when I decided to come back. The mother of a childhood friend who used to take us camping in the summer smiled at me, as did the neighbor who would press delicious treats from the city into my hand whenever she got some.
We're so happy you've come back, Sophia. Your grandmother must be so proud to have such a dependable granddaughter.
Hearing this, my grandmother's face lit up with pride. 2 years after opening my clinic, it was featured on a TV variety show as something like a clinic on the frontier. When the offer came, I thought it might be a bit of a hassle, but I decided to accept it, hoping to raise awareness about the strained healthcare situation in rural areas. The response was significant, and I received messages not only from the local community, but also from friends in the coastal town where I used to live with my parents. Most of the messages were supportive, saying things like, "You're doing great," which encouraged me. But then, a certain thought crossed my mind. Could my parents and Louis have seen it too? The truth is, I hadn't seen or spoken to my mom since my grandfather's funeral. As for my dad and Louis, I hadn't heard from them since the day they abandoned me. I wasn't hiding the fact that I had become a doctor, but since they hadn't contacted me, I had no reason to reach out to them either. I didn't even know what prestigious job my parents' pride and joy of a son had taken. But knowing my parents, I suspected that even if I were just a small town doctor, they might shamelessly try to claim credit for my success, saying, "We raised her." I wanted to believe they weren't that foolish. But they turned out to be even more shameless than I could have imagined.
I saw you on TV, Sophia. It's amazing that you become a doctor.
2 weeks after the broadcast, one evening as I locked up the clinic with my staff, an elderly couple was waiting for me. With an exhausted head, I thought, who are they again? Oh, hello.
Come on, why are you being so formal with your mom? Don't be so distant.
Excuse me? I stared at the woman who was swaying her body back and forth. Looking closely, I realized it was my mom, now with 20 years worth of additional wrinkles. The man next to her, lounging with a large belly, must be my dad. And who was that guy behind them with shaggy bangs that nearly covered his eyes? Sorry, it's been 20 years since you abandoned me, so I completely forgot what you looked like. When I answered honestly, the nurses beside me exchanged glances and whispered to each other. My mom's face tightened as she hurriedly began rattling off excuses.
Please, Sophia, don't say things that make us sound bad. We didn't abandon you. We entrusted you to your grandparents. Back then, your throat was weak and you couldn't adapt to the city air.
I was perfectly healthy and energetic, strong enough to stay unaffected even when half my class came down with the flu.
Was that so?
Oh, so that's the story you told everyone after you abandoned me. I see.
Oh, well.
Under the cold stares from me and the nurses, my mom's eyes darted around nervously. As if to interrupt this inconvenient conversation, my dad suddenly spoke up in a loud voice.
Let's not dwell on the past. You've done great here in this little town. You're my pride and joy, Sophia, the pride of the family, right, honey?
Yes, that's right.
Prompted by my dad's call for agreement, my mom nodded repeatedly like a bobblehead. So to you, the fact that you abandoned me is just some trivial matter. I see. I let out a sigh, filled with utter contempt. Then, for some reason, my dad put on a serious expression and began speaking again.
So, here's the thing. To support Sophia, the doctor in this remote town, we've decided to move here.
Wait. The absurdity of his statement left me stunned, and an unintentionally stupid sound escaped my lips. What is this man even talking about? As I stared at him in disbelief, my mom inexplicably joined in with a smug expression.
Being a doctor is hard work, isn't it? You can't do it without family support. That's why we'll help you out. Your father even quit his banking job for your sake.
What?
And guess what? Louis is also studying to get into medical school. I'm sure he'll be able to help you too.
Really?
Right, dear?
My mom cheerfully addressed the man standing next to my dad. The man she referred to as dear kept his head down, neither nodding nor shaking it. So that's my brother, Louis, at 32 years old. I couldn't even recognize him, and he looked nothing like the person I remembered. Wait, does that mean he's been stuck retaking exams this whole time? Sure, there are people who spend years retaking exams to get into medical school. But to think that my once brilliant brother had become one of them. Wouldn't it be better for him to give up and try something else at this point? There are so many things wrong with this situation and that my mind is filled with question marks. They're so shameless that I can't even feel angry anymore. It's like encountering aliens. Sophia. Evelyn, my friend and nurse, nudged my side worriedly, snapping me out of my daze. I returned to reality and took a good, long look at the people standing in front of me. Earlier, I described them as an elderly couple, but they should still be in their late 50s. The reason they look older than their actual age must be due to some kind of hardship or a desperate lifestyle. And now they're probably fantasizing about living a luxurious life as the parents of a doctor. Maybe they're hoping to fulfill dreams that my once promising brother couldn't achieve for them. I glanced at Louis, but he was still staring at the ground, his expression unreadable. Well, whatever. I don't particularly hold a grudge against him for being obedient to our parents. The only ones I can't forgive are my parents. They can reap the consequences of their actions to their heart's content. Suppressing the anger that had finally begun to surface, I forced myself to smile brightly. Thank you, Mom and Dad. You two really are reliable. When I flattered them with words I didn't mean, their faces lit up instantly. But do you think you'll be able to act like the family of a doctor?
Of course, that's what we've been preparing for all this time.
What kind of preparation? Practicing fanning themselves with their left hand. My parents, puffing and snorting, stared at me with gleaming eyes. Let's see how long this lasts. Exchanging glances with my friend, I smirked. A week later, my parents gave up their rented house and proudly moved into my grandmother's home, bringing my brother along. When my grandmother learned that my parents and brother were moving in, she was understandably furious, like a raging demon. But when I explained my plan to her, she smiled mischievously. Unaware of this, my parents unloaded their belongings into 2 vacant rooms and cheerfully roamed around the house.
Oh, for a house that's 130 years old, it's surprisingly nice. The remodeled kitchen and bathrooms seem quite usable. You know, rustic-style cafes are trending these days. Maybe I'll open one here.
My grandmother gave her a look of utter disbelief as my mom indulged in her fantasy.
I was right to leave this countryside dump.
She used to say that, and now I don't know what she's talking about. Meanwhile, my dad, sitting on the veranda, sipped alcohol he had brought with him and gazed contentedly at the garden. As for Louis, he stayed holed up in his room, and I had no idea what he was doing. My parents had a pleasant dinner prepared by my grandmother, bathed in the bathroom she had readied, and slept soundly on the bedding she had laid out for them. The next morning, I yanked the blankets off my parents and Louis, who showed no signs of waking up.
No.
The freezing, sub-zero air elicited pitiful shrieks from the groggy trio. How long do you plan on sleeping? Get ready in 5 seconds.
What?
Still too bewildered to comprehend, I shoved them into clothes and stuffed bread into their hands before loading them into the car. By the time we arrived at the clinic, the elderly patients were already waving at me, eagerly waiting.
Good morning, Dr. Sophia.
Good morning. These are my parents and brother. Please take care of them.
Oh, so these are the ones we've heard about.
The old lady's eyes gleamed mischievously.
It's going to be a busy day, isn't it?
Indeed. As the elderly women and I shared knowing smiles, my parents and Louis, still half asleep, stared in confusion. All right, as the family of a doctor working in a rural clinic, you're going to do your part to the fullest. I patted each of their shoulders firmly. From that day on, I worked them to the bone. My dad managed reception, my mom handled phone calls, and Louis served as a nursing assistant, helping the nurses however he could. The rural clinic, at the forefront of an aging society, was busy from morning to night. That's no way to treat a patient. Be more polite.
Yes, doctor.
Mom, when you finish that call, disinfect the chair over there. A child threw up on it earlier.
Yes, right away.
Louis, you're in the way. Move faster, or you'll cause an accident.
Okay.
Oh, for heaven's sake, you're useless. Even an 80-year-old woman is more capable than you. And you call yourselves the family of a doctor?
Is this really what being part of a doctor's family means?
Don't stop working.
Yes, doctor.
They were so overwhelmed and confused that they had no time to complain, as I kept piling work onto them without pause. The patients watched with amused smiles, adding unreasonable demands as they observed. By the end of the morning consultation hours, all 3 of them looked utterly exhausted. But this was far from over. Reception and phone calls. Those were tasks we had always split among everyone.
Doctor, I heard your family is going to help with the barrier-free renovations at the clinic entrance.
What?
Gary Smith, the town's sole carpenter, grinned, his white teeth shining against his sun-darkened face. My parents and Louis, sprawled out on the waiting room sofa, turned to me with expressions that screamed, "We didn't agree to this." I matched Gary's grin and replied cheerfully, "That's right. My family said they'd do anything to help me in the clinic."
Wait.
Well, such a dedicated family for Dr. Sophia. Truly admirable.
I never said.
Let's get started. If we don't begin now, we won't finish by evening.
Wait.
Gary firmly grabbed my dad's and mom's arms before they could resist. There was no way these 2 indoor types could escape the grip of his well-toned, muscular arms.
Wait, Sophia! Sophia!
In a panic, my family desperately called my name. Thank you. Family is wonderful, isn't it? I'm off to do house calls, so the rest is up to you.
Sophia!
Ignoring their tearful cries, I hopped on my bike and rode away. By the time I returned in the evening, the clinic entrance had been beautifully renovated for barrier-free access. In front of the clinic lay my parents, covered in concrete on their faces and clothes, completely drained.
Why did this happen to us?
Why? Isn't this what you wanted? To support me as a doctor?
That's not what we meant by support.
For example?
Well, things like greeting you with a warm welcome home when you're tired, or sitting together at the dinner table and laughing, something more emotional.
Oh, really? I burst into laughter, finding it utterly ridiculous, and my parents' shoulders flinched in response. What value does your welcome home have?
What?
Do you really think being welcomed by the parents who abandoned me would bring me peace? Do you believe watching the parents I despise live in luxury off the money I earned would heal me? If you honestly think that, you're completely delusional. I stopped laughing and looked down at them with a serious expression. My mom's face stiffened, but she forced a sycophantic smile.
Sophia, do you hate us? That can't be true, right? You're such a kind child after all.
What do you know about me? You neglected me even when I was living with you.
That's
My mom's lips twitched as her eyes darted around nervously. I leaned toward my frozen father and whispered gently, Dad, you said you quit your job for me, but I know the truth. You were forced into early retirement after a major screw-up, weren't you?
How do you know that?
A former classmate who saw me on TV kindly filled me in. Apparently, you messed up so badly that it became the talk of the town. They warned me to watch out because you'd probably try to cling to me.
Oh,
My dad's lips quivered, turning a pale purple. No, this man didn't quit his job, which he was close to retiring from, just to be the parent of the doctor he had abandoned. These people had already lost everything: money, status, a home, and even their brilliant son. Clinging to me was their only remaining way to survive. You thought in this town, your scandal wouldn't be discovered, and you could live in luxury as the parents of a doctor. But too bad. Everyone here knows the truth, that I was abandoned by my parents.
what?
Of course, a sad and amusing story like yours spreads quickly in a small town like this. The patients who came in today were all looking at you and thinking, these are the heartless parents who abandoned their child.
silence.
If you stay here, you'll always be seen that way. You'll live your life constantly despised. And of course, I'm not letting you spend my money for free. Only those who work harder than they did today will get to eat.
That's.
If that's okay with you, go ahead. But be prepared because I'll discard any failures who are useless.
No.
My mom let out a groan and collapsed to the floor.
This isn't how it was supposed to be.
My dad stared blankly at the floor, mumbling like a broken doll. Louis silently watched them, saying nothing. In the end, with nowhere to go and no money, my parents clung to my grandmother's house for a week. They came to realize that without working, they wouldn't get any food and felt the scornful gazes of the entire town. It seemed they understood that this place was their greatest hell. With what little money they had, they rented an old apartment in a town where they had no ties and left this place with their shoulders slumped in defeat. Honestly, my life is so fulfilling now that I don't feel attached enough to hate them. But it feels like I've saved the me who was trembling in despair on that snowy day 20 years ago, and my heart feels lighter. 3 years later.
Good afternoon, Dr. Sophia.
Good afternoon, Amelia. How are you feeling today? I was still living my busy life as a doctor in the small town that raised me. By my side were my reliable nurses and my brother Louis. Wearing a nurse's uniform, Louis busily took blood pressure readings and drew blood from our patients. After my parents ran away, he was the only one who stayed at my grandmother's house. Despite being scolded by the other nurses, he earnestly helped out at the clinic. After some time, we had a conversation. Apparently, he had been studying under our parents' orders but failed his college entrance. They made him repeat the process to get into medical school, but he couldn't find meaning in pushing himself so hard to become a doctor, and studying became torture. But working at my clinic, where he could either contribute or feel useless, made him realize that's why studying is necessary.
I'm so sorry for everything.
Louis apologized to me. While he had never reached out a helping hand to me, he had never belittled me either. Louis, who had likely been a puppet controlled by our parents, was also a victim. When I accepted his apology, he broke down in tears, as if a heavy burden had finally lifted. He continued working at my clinic while attending a night school for nursing. This year, he officially became a nurse and joined the clinic as a full-time staff member. With his earnest demeanor and modern good looks, he's a hit with the elderly patients. Whenever someone brings him a matchmaking photo, he turns bright red and shakes his head. As for me, next month, I'm getting married to my classmate from medical school, Liam. After graduation, he spent nearly a decade traveling to impoverished or war-torn countries with few doctors, working as a doctor in the world's remotest places. Last month, he finally returned to the US and proposed to me. He'll be supporting this town by working with me at my rural clinic.
Having clean water from a tap is amazing.
He laughs, ready to be both my life and work partner.
I can't leave for the other side until I can bring a photo of my great-grandchild to your grandfather.
I work hard at walking every day. The girl who once stood frozen on the cold snow is gone. Surrounded by countless warm hands, I swirled my doctor's coat. The pride of my beloved town, my clinic begins another day of work. Let's make it a great one.